Most Americans are very fragile, living in a fantasy world, thinking that tomorrow, the next year, the next 5 years, or even the next 20 years will be pretty much the same as the last few decades. And it is not likely to be. For fragility and fantasy, the canary in the coal mine for all of us may well be the so-called trans woman. Climate change, wildfires out of control, drought that is lasting much longer than is normal, increasing fights over water rights. Have you seen how low the water line is of the Colorado River, the river that provides water to 40 million people in the naturally dry American Southwest? Cyber hacking, economic instability, the inevitability of an eventual CME, the pandemic and all its cascading and unknowable variants and effects, an impending jobless underclass due to AI taking over jobs, and so much more. All of this is drastically altering the world as we have known it for all of our lives. Billionaires are preparing billion-dollar bunkers to keep themselves safe. I don't think much of the ethics of most billionaires, but I don't kid myself. They're not stupid. If they are preparing, they know something. This video is not about how these changes will affect masses of people. For that, you can Google preppers to see what many people think will happen in the future. No, we're not talking here about the consequences to humanity of change. We're talking here today more about how fragile and dependent we've allowed ourselves to become and what we can do about that. People like your neighbors, people like perhaps even you, are mostly completely unprepared for any significant societal change, either permanent or even temporary, short-term. There are people who, like many Mormons, are stockpiling food and water and supplies for a grid down situation. I don't think the average person is actually prepared to do that. If our society completely collapses, well, what's your plan after 5 years? You better live near a clean and continuous water source. You better have enough land and gardening skills to grow enough food for yourself and your family. And then, and this is a most sobering thought, you better have the weapons and the skills to use them to defend all of your stuff, because they will come for you and all of your stuff. So if society completely collapses, possibly 80% of humanity will die, and the other 20% left will be in the same boat, all of us, and we'll have to figure it out together, whatever the conditions are. I think a more likely probability for us all in the near term, in the next 10 to 20 years, is a 2-week at minimum and 2 to 3 month at maximum interruption of the many services like water, food, and electricity that we now take completely for granted. But most people are not prepared for even that possibility. Studies show that most people do not have more than a week or two of food in their pantry and fridge, and no water stored at all. Most people think that somehow, no matter what, the water out of their tap is just going to magically keep coming, and it may not. This information is not about food and water prepping. I do teach classes in how to prep for a 3-month grid down scenario. If you're interested in that, you can email us using the subject line Queen Prepper. This information here today is to ask us all to consider how fragile and dependent each of us personally has become upon things remaining exactly as they are now. our systems, all our systems that we have grown so reliant upon, remaining intact with no significant interruption. So sure, we've all experienced here in Southern California, at least, the rolling blackouts that leave us without power for a hot afternoon. And those don't worry us too much. They're an inconvenience, certainly, but we are entirely confident that the power we rely on to run our lives normally will be back soon. Consider how nearly every aspect of modern life is dependent upon a very complex and, in fact, very fragile system of delivery. It's called the just-in-time system of delivery. Grocery stores are stocked just in time for them to run out. Three days, in advance, 3 days. If the supply chain were to fail after 3 days, there would be no food in the grocery store. Consider how life would look if the government could not get the power back on for some reason, for even 2 months. Think about what your life would look like then. No phones, no lights, no tap water, because that requires electricity to generate it. No heat in the winter, no AC in the summer, no fridge, no freezer, maybe no car because maybe no gas, nothing in the grocery store shelves, no ambulance arriving if you're sick, no police arriving if someone is breaking into your house, no one to call for help. Look what happened to Argentina just 20 years ago. Argentina is not a developing nation. 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. Argentina has for a long time been a very sophisticated culture, very developed in every way. Just a few decades ago, Argentina had one of the 10 highest per capita GDP levels globally, on par with Canada and Australia and ahead of both France and Italy. However, the economy started to decline rapidly after an anti-labor policy increased the debt burden and interrupted the normal industrial development that was keeping things afloat. Over 400,000 companies of all sizes went bankrupt by 1982. The government tried to fix it, but as usual, made it much worse and caused the out of control hyperinflation of 1989 and 90. Even if you had some money, it was now worth 70% less than before the collapse. Imagine you think you have $100 when you're going to the grocery store, but now you only have 30. Argentina's economy and society pretty much completely collapsed by 2001. The average person suddenly found themselves without clean water or food. Things went nuts. Crime skyrocketed, criminals preyed upon the unprotected and unprepared. Everyone had to become a prepper overnight, but it was far too late. By that time, all the stores had been looted and the supply chain completely disrupted. There was massive suffering and death. People have written books about it, terrifying books. We don't think too much about Argentina here in America, but it is also a canary in a coal mine for every so-called Western civilization. In our queen teachings, we talk about how a good queen, a good architect of life, is prepared as best she can be for whatever is likely to happen to her and to her family. She doesn't make herself nuts. She doesn't ruin her life anxiously dwelling every day on every horrific possibility of the future. No, she simply prepares as best she can, and then she just goes ahead and lives her life. It's easy to prepare food and water for 3 months. You buy 3 months worth of freeze-dried food in cans, put it in your cupboard, 3 months of water in what are called water bricks, BPA-free containers that stack up. You have a good first aid kit, a solar panel that attaches to a solar generator, much easier and cheaper than you might imagine, and a good toolkit. You keep your car never less than 3/4 full. And obviously there is a lot more to know than that, but Those are the places that you start. If you haven't done those things, if you think that nothing is ever going to change and that resources will always be available to you, if you think that if things do change, if you think that the government will swoop in to save you, you may well be living in a fantasy land. You are perhaps very much more fragile than you realize. There is something even more important than just the stockpiling of physical resources for an emergency. It is about, first, your mindset, and second, the current condition of your body, because those two things are far more important ultimately than having a supply of food and water. Staying strong and balanced mentally under great stress is not something most Americans are prepared for. Social media has already caused a cascade of mental health problems, and COVID isolation and disruption has multiplied them. So we can ask ourselves, are we solid? Are you solid in your mind? Or do you suffer frequently from depression, anxiety, or other mental imbalance? You will probably be among the first to go in a true long-term emergency. You will be the first that the bad guys will be likely to prey upon. We don't need fragile people in a grid down scenario of system collapse. What we need are strong, solid people who can gather community together and figure things out together to respond to whatever the new situation is, to respond with good hearts, with common sense, and to respond with an attitude of not the hell with you, I'm going to take care of myself, but respond with an attitude of taking care of everyone around you. Are you solid in your body? Or are you at least making efforts to get healthier while things are relatively good? If you're currently eating the standard American diet and drinking soda, none of that's going to be available to you in an emergency situation. McDonald's and Taco Bell, they're not going to be open. Plus, if you eat that way, you might very well be diabetic or possibly pre-diabetic. 1 in 3 Americans is pre-diabetic. 1 in 3. Insulin will not be available in a grid down scenario. And if somehow you do get the insulin that you need, you probably won't be able to keep it cold. Do you take multiple drugs to stay alive? They won't be available past the point they are looted out of every Rite Aid and CVS in your area. Do you live paycheck to paycheck without any savings? Will your job be available in a grid down scenario? In the first few months of COVID lockdown, hundreds of thousands of people had their lives disrupted, lost their jobs, so much more. Most of the people who lost their jobs had little to no savings, and that was just a pandemic. Basic systems were and are still functioning. If things get temporarily worse, we may well ask ourselves, how are we going to keep our home and our family safe? My point is that mentally, most of us are living in a temporary bubble, a fantasy world that has worked up until now. We've lost the ability to be self-reliant. And this is something that most of our forebears had a lot more of than we do now. As a nation, we are incredibly dependent upon things remaining the same, upon things and systems continuing to work as they do right now. We are so fragile that if these systems are even interrupted for 2 or 3 months, many of us may not make it. This fragility is best exemplified by the trans community. It is not physically possible to change sex, but you can make an attempt to fake it. You can have a fantasy in your mind about changing sex. Think about it. To pretend to be of another sex, to continue to live out what is essentially a fantasy that has no basis in biological reality. This requires massive resources from your culture, resources completely external to you and your ability to control them. Let's talk about men who want to present as women, because they are actually the ones who require the most resources. To maintain his fantasy, such a man has to have special clothes and makeup and wigs and false fingernails, special surgeries to feminize the facial bone structure and remove the Adam's apple. He has to have surgeries if he goes that far, and many so-called trans women do not, but if he really wants to complete the fantasy, he has to have surgeries to amputate his penis and fashion a neo-vagina, as they are calling it. If he's young, he has to take puberty-blocking drugs. No matter his age, he has to take hormones for his entire life. He is medicalized for life. He is dependent upon medical systems outside himself, systems over which he has no personal control, to maintain his fantasy world. In a world where the climate is warming, snowflakes are not going to last very long. And this is the extreme example of a person who is mentally imbalanced to the point where only if society completely bows to his fantasy and provides him with all of these things, and they will because it's great profit as long as everything's still working, only then can he sustain any semblance of this fantasy. Society is already talking about forcing insurance companies to pay for sex change operations. Do you think that medical insurance is going to be around after a catastrophic meltdown of the world as we know it? It will not be. And no one will be interested in supporting your fantasy idea of yourself if it costs them essential resources. When people are scrambling for water, no one is going to care about your demands for hormones. Your extreme needs will be seen for what they are, not real needs, and your perceived needs will cease to be a priority for the others around you. No one is going to care about pronouns when people are pressed to the limit, just trying to survive. There's no room, there's no energy, there's no resources, there's no money, there's no time for fantasy in a situation of pure survival mode. In those situations, life strips you down to the bare bones reality that you must face or die. Well, Ava, you may say, I'm not trans, so this doesn't apply to me. Does it not? The example of the so-called trans woman is simply an extreme example of how so many of us are functioning right now. If you start looking into it, you will see that the system in which we place so much faith is shockingly more fragile than we could ever have imagined. To prevent widespread panic, this fact has been deliberately hidden from us, but we did get a little taste of it during the toilet paper wars at the market in the first couple of months of COVID. And that was just toilet paper. Imagine if we were fighting over food, actual food. If you start looking into your own life, you may see, many of us may see, how fragile and dependent we are as individuals on systems external to ourselves, systems over which we have no control. I'm asking all of us to look at how self-reliant we are right now, or how fragile we might be right now, how much we might truly depend on the system as it is currently configured to bring us what we think we need. Could you live without coffee? How would you do without your Xanax, your Klonopin, your Valium? Would having no Netflix or YouTube to watch, would being forced to play games and read a book by candlelight drive you nuts? If you can't get insulin, if you can't get your statins, you can't get your metformin, you can't get your lisinopril, you can't get your antibiotics, you can't get your calcium channel blockers, will you get very, very sick if you can't get these things? Or will you die? If you can't get your pot, your weed, your alcohol, your wine, your scotch, will you be absolutely miserable? If you can't get an aspirin to relieve your backache, what will you do? How will you function? In a real emergency, will FEMA be handing out false eyelashes along with water? I think not. So this is why I have stockpiled 5 years of beauty products. You know where to come for your beauty supplies when the apocalypse hits. In the past 20 years, 1 million people have died from drug overdose. 1 million people. And over 70% of those overdose deaths were from prescription opioids. If there is a true interruption of services, those drugs are not going to be available for long, or they may be around, but their price will skyrocket and you'll have to sell your body and your soul to get your hands on them. In a true emergency, when you will have so much to deal with, do you also want to have to contend with your own personal addictions, making you even more miserable? Get free now while things are pretty good, while you have a lot of support. In Argentina, when everything collapsed and the money was no good, people were bartering and using alcohol, sugar, coffee, pain relievers, and chocolate as money. Not because they were necessary to life, but because a huge percentage of the population was willing to do almost anything to get those things. I'm saying that the time is now, when things are still relatively good, to start preparing our minds and our bodies to be strong if a situation of greater challenge presents itself. Let's not be fragile. Let's be the strong, smart, sensible, prepared ones. And if a disaster never happens, so we're strong and we're smart. No downside. But Ava, you say, I'm poor, I have no money left over at the end of the month to build up a pantry of food and supplies. Believe me, I completely get it. No one is more aware of and sensitive to the dire straits that this patriarchal system has created for women and their children right now. But there are many things that you can do to get stronger without costing you anything but a little bit of time. One thing you can do is, if you live in a really bad part of town, if you live in a place that's both very poor and crime-ridden, spend as much time out of that setting as you can. Go to a lovely park as close as you can, nearby, if you can find one, or shop at a grocery store, even if you don't buy anything, that's in a better neighborhood once in a while. This will help refine your vibration, and it will make next steps to making life easier and gathering more resources. It'll make the next steps easier for you. Don't sit home watching TV. That crashes your vibration. Get to nature as much as possible, because there is no poverty in nature. And there are other things you can do that cost no money. If our bodies are in bad shape, let's start to take getting stronger really seriously. It is never too late. Bodies can change dramatically at any age with different food, different exercise, different treatment. If you eat 4 or 5 or 6 times a day, that's very dangerous. You are spiking your blood sugar and causing insulin resistance. And in any kind of emergency, you may not be able to feed yourself that frequently every day, and you will be miserable. You will suffer. So learn about intermittent fasting. Start slowly and work yourself up to eating twice or just once a day. It can be done. I've done it. I didn't think I could do it. I do it now. And it was not that hard. And I feel so much better. Doctors like Jason Fung are curing people with diabetes right and left with intermittent fasting. Check out his book, The Diabetes Code. You can cure yourself of many, many things. Look into holistic ways of living, because in an emergency, those are going to be the only ways we'll be able to treat ourselves. You'll feel better and you'll be more self-reliant. You'll be closer to nature. If you drink soda every day, you are 60% more likely to develop diabetes. So stop now while it's still a choice for you. If you're addicted to sugar, to coffee, to chocolate, to alcohol, start to wean yourself off these substances. They are not necessary to life. Make them a choice or an occasional treat, but not a daily necessity. Addiction to them makes you weak. If you take prescription drugs to manage your depression or anxiety or high blood pressure, perhaps start looking into meditation and other natural forms of dealing with those things. If you have an illness for which there is no natural help, but for which you must have pharmaceuticals, then perhaps start stockpiling them if you can, and make sure you have a good supply and cycle them out very frequently so that when you need them, they're not expired. The most important single thing you can do is to build your community of support. I know many women, especially a lot of elder women, who are very lonely. They have little connection to friends or to family. They have no one to help them in case of emergency. We must change this for ourselves. We women must look to building community so that we can better weather whatever might happen. If you're a woman with no support system, start taking some kind of action. Do anything. Start inviting another woman or two over for tea or dinner. Build something, some kind of support system. We human beings are indeed social animals. Of course, we depend upon the systems around us to survive. This is only natural. Ancient humans living in tribes of 100 to 150 people thousands of years ago certainly depended upon each other to live, especially, of course, the very young and the very old. All of this is completely natural, but we may have entered a state where we are too dependent upon too much. We may be living in a fantasy world if we think nothing is going to change in the future. There's only one thing we can count on, and that is change. No major civilization from our history as humans on Mother Earth has lasted for very long without major change happening. None, not one. Our American way of life may change too. So let's be ready, at least at a bare minimum, in a bare minimum way, to take care of ourselves and our families. And of course, we can't predict or prepare for every last possibility. But when you've done what you can, what you reasonably can, to be self-reliant, to take care of yourself, it brings an amazing sense of peace and confidence to your daily life. We women cannot rely on patriarchy and its systems to take care of us. Systems devised by men have never taken care of women and children, ever. In fact, quite the opposite. They never have, and they never will. For women, self-reliance is a good thing. Let's start building a culture that takes care of individuals and families and communities, a truly human culture of goodness, led by women, a culture where we all, yes, rely on each other, and yes, where it is safe for us to do so. In the meantime, let's be self-reliant so we can survive long enough to lead the change. Blessed be.